Lucario has a weaker field phase due to the fact that he doesn't have any projectiles that can phase shift the opponent from full screen, and the projectiles he does have can get out prioritized and blasted through easily by stronger ones. Also, his opponent can throw out his own set of traps and projectiles to lock Lucario down and prevent him from getting in, which is how he will win, getting up close to his opponent and threatening them. However, Lucario can zone and throw projectiles. You'll typically want to do this against matchups where the opponent will either be throwing out traps or projectiles that are slower from full screen. This will include using Neutral Y, Level 1 and 2 Aura Sphere, Jump Aura Sphere, JY, and all your other projectiles to either punish the opponent for throwing a projectile or forcing them to block so you can walk in on them, since the reason you want to use your projectiles to close in is because you don't have any projectiles that can immediately shift the opponent from full screen. You'll want to throw projectiles to force your opponent to block so you can get into center stage and then threaten a move that can shift the opponent. The only time you'll want to use level 3 Aura Sphere in neutral is to blast through stronger projectiles but have a lower projectile priority than Aura Sphere itself. Because Lucario fits the Counter-Striker archetype, his main objective should be the centre of the stage, not round about the middle, but dead on centre. Because this range is where Lucario is the most threatening thanks to Side Y and Bone Rush. Being a good whiff punish tool, Bone Rush can make sure that your opponent cannot whiff an unsafe button or do an unsafe move on block, since they will always be punished for it. Another benefit to being in center stage is that you can use Side Y to safely poke at the opponent to get phase shifts, or to punish your opponent if they attempt to hit back against it. Once you've gotten your opponent into that Bone Rush Side Y range, they are now not able to use any committal moves and will be forced to be either very safe or back off, or just get right up close to you. All of these situations will allow you to brawl with your opponent and get up close, forcing homing attacks, counter attacks, and these moves that will actually shift the opponent. For homing does have some problems, mostly the fact that it is slower, meaning it will be out prioritized by other faster homing attacks that have more priority, and it can be perfect blocked, meaning you can't just use homing attack recklessly. Keep in mind that if your opponent does perfect block your counter attack, they cannot grab or challenge it as it will frame trap, meaning the only thing that they can do is counter attack after the perfect block. As a result, to avoid a perfect block, you can simply do the first hit of your homing to try and bait it. However, the issue is if you don't go into the second hit of homing, it is incredibly difficult to hit confirm the first hit into the second on reaction, meaning that you could have hit your opponent with the first hit of homing and won field, but you didn't follow up. Yet at the same time, if you go into the second hit of homing too recklessly, your opponent can perfect block it and you could lose field phase. As a result, for using homing attack up close to the opponent, you should mix up between going for the first hit into the second, to either hit confirm the first and only the first to bait your opponent into counter-attacking and potentially punishing it. Also, thanks to the multi-hit on Lucario's homing attack, it is very good at going through vulnerable frames of. When it comes to using armor up close, you should avoid using the charged version whenever possible, since your opponent can simply get over it on reaction. The only time you want to use the charged version of counterattack is if you actually armor something and want to then shift the opponent with it. The uncharged version is typically safer since it is harder to grab on reaction, however an opponent can still jump over it pretty safely to get the guaranteed punish. This means that while Lucario can benefit from using armor, you do want to be very careful with it since your opponent can easily punish things on reaction. But using uncharged counter can easily catch someone off guard. The occasional Force Palm should also be thrown in since it does a good amount of chip damage, and it can be effective for going through armor. If you do hit it, it will reward 140 damage, half your synergy meter, and allows you to get an Okizeme, which could lead to more damage. You do want to be careful though, because if your opponent armors it all the way, not only will they punish you, but they will get half of their synergy instead. Also, you are -8, so make sure to homing cancel after every force palm to avoid grabs. If you read the homing cancel, you can do a delayed grab to punish Lucario instead. This will lose if Lucario just goes straight into homing attack. Since he's minus, if you homing first, you will punish him, so weigh up your risk reward carefully. For grabbing yourself, it's like I just mentioned. If your opponent is not homing cancelling afterwards, then you can sneak in free grabs. If your opponent is homing cancelling, then you'll want to be a little more careful. Instead, you'll want to use delayed grabs. And you'll obviously want to use grabs if you can react to counterattacks, or to attempt to punish your opponent for doing something unsafe. Otherwise, grabbing in neutral is a little risky since homing cancelling is so prevalent with them. Lastly, it's important to keep in mind that once you shift the opponent from duel phase back to field, what OP options you have. For example, if you grab the opponent, you will hard knockdown, and that will allow you to set up a meaty level 3 Aura Sphere, which will just get you free chip damage. Even if the opponent just tries to counter this, you can punish them with Bone Rush. Out of a fourth palm, you can get a level 2 Aura Sphere, but you'll have to visually time it. Lucario wins duel phase by getting mostly into 2Y range where he can threaten his opponent and force overcommitments to try and get over it, using 6X to get hard knockdowns, along with 8X to force Okizemis, as well as anti-airing jumps with 8Y and extreme speed. And lastly, using Bone Rush to whiff punish. Now, if that all sounded a bit too simple, it's because it kind of is but isn't at the same time. Lucario is a very straightforward character. Lucario does not have any gimmicks or setups. He does not have cheap tricks. He doesn't have extremely high damaging combos. And he doesn't have any powerful command grabs or mix-ups. As well as he lacks extremely powerful zoning tools. So instead, Lucario actually makes up for not having those things by being extremely reliant on fundamentals. Fundamentals refer to your presence of mind while playing, and it can include While there are other things, these are the ones in particular that Lucario will excel at the most. For example, even though 2Y is safe, if you misspace it, you can get punished. But if you space it a little better, it's easier to avoid those punishes and get potential whiff punishes off your opponent. 5YY is usually -8 on block. But if you actually know that your opponent is going to try that, you could just 5YY into Force Palm, which will frame trap your opponent. Or just go for the third hit of 5Y. Meaning your opponent is less likely to press buttons now that they've gotten hit with that, meaning they've been conditioned to hold block more. This can also open them up to getting grabbed. After that, they might also counter, which will beat the Force Palm. It's okay if you get hit by this, because it just means that you can now adapt and you've conditioned your opponent even further. This could also condition your opponent to jump away. Or jump over you. I want to point out here in all these examples that none of these are incorrect or unsafe plays, but they're actually the correct plays that you can punish from your opponent after you've done a significant amount of conditioning. When it comes to baiting, an example that you can use is if you press 2Y a lot, you can bait your opponent to use 8X to try and go over it. If you've baited that enough, you can then just throw out preemptive 8Ys to catch their attempts to get over it. Another way that you can do it is with 8Y instead. Because if your opponent sees 8Y, they might be tempted to try and go under it, which you can beat with 8X. Lastly, a good way to punish 8X in neutral aside from with punishing it is to, of course, anti-air it with your opponent's 8Y. So if you press 8X a lot in neutral, your opponent might be tempted to throw out preemptive 8Ys, and again, you can just go under those. You can also just use 8X to try and get your opponent to throw out 8Ys and then with punish them. This also ties into conditioning, since if you punish your opponent 8X with 8Y, etc, and so on, you'll discourage your opponent from doing it again, and can now take advantage of new options that they might pick. Once you've sufficiently baited and conditioned your opponent, you can start making hard reads, and the more information you have, the harder of a read you can make. You could even go for dangerous ones like grabs or hard callouts. At the start, you'll want to stick to options that are going to work against the opponent no matter what they pick. In the end, this means you'll have suffocated their options and there's only one that they'll be able to pick. And then you can sufficiently deal with it. Even if you make the wrong read and get punished for it, it's not the end of the world, as even if you take the damage, you now have that information for later and know that you can do something else instead. The objective now that you've baited, conditioned and read your opponent is that you've now suffocated their options and they can only really pick one. And that will almost always be the safest option. Otherwise, your opponent will have to make a dangerous guess that could result in them losing a lot of health simply because you've conditioned, you've baited, and now you can make the reads. And this will all be better if your spacing is more on point as well. Pressure is what you want to do to push your opponent to the corner where you will be at a more significant advantage over your opponent. If you don't apply pressure, the opponent can do whatever they want and you'll have to deal with their pressure instead. You will have to adapt to them when it should be the other way around, and you should be making them adapt to you. They won't be giving you the chance to punish mistakes and you'll end up getting cornered and losing the game. When it comes to applying pressure, there's three different things you want to keep in mind when doing it. First, you want to apply your pressure accurately. For example, 2Ying from well out of your opponent's range isn't pressuring anyone. On the plus side, 2Ying from point blank isn't going to help in a lot of situations, so it's better to space. You also want to make sure you're applying that pressure quickly so that your opponent has less time to react and form a game plan around it. And finally, you'll want to apply your pressure creatively, because if you do the same kind of pressure over and over again, your opponent will simply be able to react to it and they'll adapt. It's also important to keep into account that different opponents and characters can put on pressure in different ways, and some characters and opponents will put on pressure by getting right into your face and forcing you to make decisions that could be dangerous. And some characters will use projectiles to pressure you from full screen, and it will be up to you to find ways to get in and put the pressure onto them. It'll be up to you to adapt to this pressure and come up with your own creative pressure. Finally, once you've pushed your opponent to the corner, you're fully in control. There are two different ways that Lucario can play corner pressure. He can either get right up to his opponent, which will allow for 5Y pressure, 2Y and 8Y to catch jumps. However, the downside of being this close to your opponent is that they can easily jump over you to get out of the corner. The only thing that you can kind of do to stop that is to hit them with extreme speed and then maybe swap back. Another benefit to being at this range is that your frame 11 6YY punish can easily just splat your opponent onto the wall for a big wall combo. The other way and the more preferred way is to actually back off and be just outside of 2Y range. From this range you can space and outzone your opponent, as they won't be able to get over 2Y unless they have an AX that can go over it. If they try to jump over, they'll only land in front of you, so they'll still be in the corner. And you can get the more rewarding 8Y anti-air, allowing for some bonus loops that could splat them onto the wall. And you can still get 6YY with punishes. When it comes to support Pokemon in Pokken, you can either pick a support to counter a specific matchup, like you can pick Molga to counter Scizor, Lapras for something like Braixen, Rotom for a character like Decidueye, Umbreon for a character like Machamp, or Dragonite for Shadow Mewtwo. Pachirisu can be a good pick for Lucario to help him win field easier by nullifying your opponent's projectiles and giving you easy Bone Rush punishes. You could also use Whimsicott for this exact same purpose. Keep in mind that Whimsicott charges slower than Jirachi but will protect you for longer. But also that Pachirisu will protect you from more projectiles than Whimsicott will. Farfetch'd in field phase in particular can be a good option for either locking down your opponent after they throw a projectile, or for allowing you to get easy phase shifts if they press buttons. Farfetch'd can also be helpful in Joe phase for similar purposes. In both phases, Latios can be a good choice for locking your opponent down and helping you win field phase easier. However, ultimately, Lucario doesn't struggle with any matchup in particular that he needs a support to win it. So you can really be flexible and pick whoever you like. But aside from countering specific characters, Lucario appreciates supports that boost his damage, and there are 4 that typically come to mind. One of the first popular one is Eevee. Eevee will give you access to 2Y, 8Y, 5Y, 6Y and 6YY, and most importantly, Bone Rush when fighting burst opponents that get your synergy gauge buff faster than you do. Also, Lucario in general just appreciates Eevee's damage boost. Victini will also give you the same benefits as Eevee for dealing with bursted opponents, while also making sure that every 2Y will combo into Force Palm, every 8Y will combo into 2Y in Bone Rush, and that every 8X will allow you to get a full combo off the launcher. Just keep in mind that Victini does not charge as fast as Eevee, so you won't have easy access to it. Lastly, if you want a bit of both worlds, you can go with Mew, which will give you either the attack boost, giving you the Eevee buff, the crit boost, giving you basically the Victini buff, or it could potentially give you both, skyrocketing Lucario's damage into the highest it can go. It could also give you utterly nothing, so it depends on how reliable you want your support to be. Keep in mind, Mew charges faster than both Eevee and Victini. Arguably, however, Lucario's most popular overall support is Jirachi. Jirachi will give you a boost to your synergy boost, allowing you to get it faster. Jirachi will also give you the synergy boost buff, which will first up drastically increase your damage. It will also decrease the damage you take while in burst. Without Jirachi, this leaves me at 480 health, and with Jirachi, this leaves me at 504, meaning you get the attack boost of an Eevee and the defense boost of a Sylveon while in burst. However, Jirachi is not very useful when you don't have burst. However, at 150cc, with the ability to build your own meter by whiffing Force Palm in field, plus using the support cheer to make sure you have Jirachi at all times in round 2 and 3, and this means you can also call Jirachi at the start of a round if you've just used your burst, and by the time you're ready to use it again, it will have recharged. At 150cc, you will be getting burst every round, so Jirachi is more than worth it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share it around. Both part 1 and part 2 of this guide took a lot of time and work for me, so I would really appreciate it. I may do more character guides in the future, I'm uncertain yet, but it's something that I'm considering. Thank you all very much for watching.